Jake had driven through rough places before, but nothing like this. A wrong turn had led him straight into cartel territory, and now 4 masked gunmen stood in the road ahead, rifles aimed, blocking his only exit. They thought they had an easy target, a lone trucker, outnumbered and outgunned, but they didn't know Jake, and they had no idea they just made the last mistake of their lives. What would you do if you found yourself in Jake's situation? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more thrilling stories from the road. Jake had been driving for hours, his hands steady on the wheel as his rig rumbled down the lonely desert highway. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the cracked asphalt. He was no stranger to the road, to the endless miles stretching out ahead, but tonight, something felt off. His fuel gauge hovered just above empty, and the next town was still miles away. He cursed under his breath. There was an old gas station marked on his mapone of those places truckers used when they had no other choice. He figured it was better than running dry in the middle of nowhere. As he turned onto a narrow side road, the pavement gave way to dirt and dust. His headlights cut through the dark, revealing a flickering neon sign in the distance. Open 24 hours. The station was barely more than a shack with a single rusted pump, but it would have to do. Jake pulled up, killed the engine, and stepped out. The air was thick and still, the silence unsettling. He grabbed the nozzle and inserted it into his tank, his ears picking up the faint sound of a radio playing inside the station. Then he noticed them. A group of men, half hidden in the shadows near the edge of the lot. 4, maybe 5. They weren't truckers. Too still, too quiet. Dressed in dark clothing, their faces obscured by bandanas, their eyes locked on him. Jake kept his movements calm, slow. He'd been in bad places before, knew the kind of men who lurked at spots like this. He glanced at the gas pump hold, slow. He had at least 2 more minutes before his tank was full. One of the men stepped forward, a tall figure with broad shoulders. "Evening, driver," he said, his voice casual but carrying a weight that didn't sit right. Jake nodded. "Evening." The man took another step closer. "You're a long way from the highway." Jake shrugged, keeping his posture relaxed. Needed fuel. The other men started to move, spreading out slightly, closing the space between them and the truck. The air tightened, the unease growing. "You ain't from around here, are ya?" the man asked, his tone still friendly, but Jake knew better. "Nope," Jake answered simply. The man grinned, but there was no warmth behind it. "See, out here, things work a little different. Ain't safe to be alone at night." Jake felt his muscles tense, his instincts screaming. The pump clicked, signaling a full tank. He slowly removed the nozzle, hooked it back onto the pump, and tightened the cap on his truck's fuel tank. The men were too close now. Jake met the leader's gaze, his voice calm but firm. "I appreciate the concern, but I'll be on my way." The man chuckled, shaking his head. "Now, that ain't how this works." Behind him, another man shifted, and Jake caught the gleam of something metallic under his jacket. A gun? A knife? Didn't matter. Jake had seen this play before. They thought he was just another trucker, just another easy target. They had no idea. Jake kept his expression neutral, but his body was coiled, ready. He had spent years on the road, seen all kinds of trouble, and he knew one thing when men like this started circling. They weren't just looking for a conversation. The leader, the one with the broad shoulders, took another step forward, his boots scraping against the dry dirt. His grin widened. "Now, see, trucker? I think you owe us a little something for using our station." Jake exhaled slowly, didn't realize this was a toll road. The men chuckled, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that put anyone at ease. It was the kind that said they were just getting started. One of the guys to the left cracked his knuckles. Another slid his jacket back slightly, flashing the handle of a knife at his waist. The leader motioned toward the truck. "That's a nice rig you got. Must be carrying something valuable." Jake's grip tightened near his belt, where his own steel rested, but he didn't move just yet. "Just hauling freight," he said, voice even. The leader smirked. "That so? Then you won't mind letting us have a look?" Jake didn't blink. "I mind." Silence. A long, tense moment passed. Then the leader sighed, shaking his head like a disappointed parent. "You know, I try to be polite," he said, rubbing his jaw. "But some folks just don't listen." Behind him, One of the men stepped forward. Reaching into his jacket, Jake moved before he could think. His hand shot to his hip, gripping the handle of his revolver. The men froze. The leader's grin faltered for the first time. "Easy now," he said, raising a hand. "Ain't no need for that." Jake's voice was steady as a rock. "That's where you're wrong." The air was thick with tension, the kind that made it feel like the whole world was holding its breath. The other men shifted, their bravado slipping. They had expected a victim, a scared trucker who would hand over his wallet and his cargo. Instead, they had found a man who was ready to fight. The leader's eyes darkened. "You really want to do this?" Jake didn't answer. He didn't have to, because at that moment, the headlights of an approaching vehicle cut through the darkness. Someone else was coming. And Jake wasn't sure if that was good or bad. Jake had given them every chance to back off. He had stayed calm, measured, in control. But now the time for patience was over. The leader took another step forward, his confidence returning as the approaching vehicle slowed in the distance. "Looks like your luck's running out, trucker." His men chuckled, their hands hovering near weapons. Jake sighed, shaking his head. "Number yours is." And with that, he moved, faster than they expected. His hand snapped to his revolver, the steel gleaming under the fading desert sun. In one smooth motion, he cocked the hammer and aimed straight at the leader's chest. The gang's laughter died instantly. "Whoa now," the leader muttered, holding up his hands. But Jake saw the twitch in his fingers, the tell that he was still calculating an attack. "Don't," Jake warned, voice low and firm. The other men shifted uncomfortably. One of them reached for something, but Jake's gun was already pointed in his direction. "Next man that moves," Jake said, his tone steady as iron, "doesn't get to walk away." Silence. Even the desert wind seemed to hold its breath. The leader licked his lips, eyes darting to his men. He was realizing, too late, that they had made a serious mistake. Jake stepped forward, just enough to make them flinch. "You picked the wrong truck." The headlights behind them grew brighter. The sound of approaching engines rumbled through the dust. And suddenly, the gang wasn't just worried about Jake anymore. The leader clenched his jaw, his confidence slipping as the dust clouds behind Jake thickened. More headlights appeared in the distance, big rigs rolling in like a steel-armored cavalry. His gang shifted uneasily. They weren't expecting this. Jake smirked. "Guess I'm not as alone as you thought." The leader sneered, but there was no real defiance left in his eyes. "You think a few truckers are gonna scare us?" Jake didn't lower his gun. He simply tilted his head toward the growing line of 18-wheelers coming down the highway. Their air horns blared through the night, a deep, bone-rattling sound that echoed across the desert. More than a dozen rigs, headlights burning bright, rolled to a stop behind Jake's truck. The leader swallowed hard. The truckers stepped out, men and women hardened by the road, their boots crunching on the dirt. Some carried tire irons, others baseball bats, a few even had their own firearms, resting easy in calloused hands. The gang was outnumbered, outgunned, and worst of all, out of time. Jake took another step forward. "Last chance. Drop your weapons. Walk away. Maybe you live to make better choices." One of the gang members, a younger guy with shaking hands, was the first to give in. He tossed his knife to the ground and took a step back, his eyes darting between Jake and the approaching truckers. Another followed, dropping his pistol like it was burning a hole through his hand. But the leader? He was too deep in. His pride wouldn't let him back down. He spat in the dirt and grabbed for his gun. Crack! A shot rang out, and the leader howled in pain, stumbling backward as Jake's bullet ripped through the sand just inches from his boot. Jake leveled the revolver again. "Next one won't miss." The leader froze. His breath came in short, ragged bursts. His hands trembled as he slowly, reluctantly, let the gun slip from his fingers. It landed in the dirt with a dull thud. The other truckers moved in, circling the gang like wolves around wounded prey. The leader looked around. His bravado shattered. His men were backing away, shaking their heads. They knew this was over. One of the older truckers, a grizzled man with a thick beard, leaned in and chuckled. "You boys ain't as scary when you're on the wrong end of a fight." Another trucker grabbed the leader by the collar and yanked him forward. "Now, you're going to apologize, to all of us, loud enough so we can hear it over our engines." The leader's face burned with humiliation, but with a dozen truckers staring him down, he had no choice. He swallowed his pride and muttered, "I'm sorry." The trucker yanked him closer, louder. The leader's jaw clenched, his lips curled in disgust. But he knew he had no way out. "I said I'm sorry," his voice echoed into the desert. The truckers laughed, shaking their heads. Jake holstered his revolver and leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now get out of my sight." The gang didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled to their bikes and trucks, tripping over themselves as they sped away, leaving behind their weapons, their pride, and their reputation in the dust. As the last of them disappeared over the horizon, the truckers cheered. Jake turned back to his rig, exhaling slowly. Another fight, another day. But one thing was certain, no one would dare mess with truckers again. The engines of the big rigs rumbled softly as the dust settled. The night stretched out across the desert, silent except for the occasional crackle of cooling metal. The gang was gone, their pride shattered, their weapons left behind as a reminder that they had underestimated the wrong man. Jake exhaled, rolling his shoulders as he walked back toward his truck. A few truckers patted him on the back as he passed, nodding in quiet respect. They didn't need to say much out here. Actions spoke louder than words. An older trucker, Lou, shook his head with a chuckle. "Hell of a night, huh?" Jake smirked. "Could have been quieter." Lou glanced at the abandoned weapons in the dirt. "Yeah, well, sometimes people need a reminder that truckers ain't easy targets." He spit in the dirt. "Used to be, folks had respect. Now, kids think we're just old men behind the wheel." Jake leaned against his rig, staring out at the horizon. "They think we're alone out here, that we don't watch each other's backs." He glanced at the other truckers standing together, their rigs lined up like sentinels. Tonight proved otherwise. Lou nodded. "Damn right." The other truckers started heading back to their rigs, one by one. Engines roared to life, headlights piercing the darkness. Jake climbed up into his cab, gripping the worn leather of the steering wheel. As he sat there, staring down the open road, he thought about the gang. The way they laughed, the way they assumed they could take whatever they wanted. People like that didn't understand real work, real struggle. They didn't understand the code. Truckers lived by a different set of rules: respect, hard work, and loyalty. They didn't start fights, but they damn sure finished them. Jake reached for the gear shift, then paused. He glanced at the camera mounted on his dash, the red recording light blinking softly. Turning it toward himself, he took a deep breath and hit the button. "If you're watching this," he said, his voice steady, "remember this. Out on the road, you look out for your own. You don't let people take what ain't theirs. You don't back down when it matters." He let his words settle for a moment, then smirked. "And if some punk thinks a trucker's an easy target, well, they'll learn the hard way." He clicked the camera off, shifted into gear, and pulled onto the highway. As the desert stretched out before him, he let out a slow breath. Another fight, another day. But the message was clear: truckers weren't just men behind the wheel. They were a brotherhood, a family, and no one messed with family. What do you think? Have you ever seen someone underestimate the wrong person? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this, hit like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more real stories from the road.